Last week we talked about the fact that God expects that our gifts to Him will be costly to us. And we ended with the question, well, how costly? Just how much are we supposed to give? And I promise I'd tell you that this week, so let's get to it. 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and following, 1 Corinthians 16, 1. Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given order to the churches of Galatia, even so do ye. Upon the first day of the week, let every one of you lay by him in store, as God has prospered you, that there may be no gathering when I come. Now the operative phrase here is, as God has prospered you. But what does that mean? Now here's where people begin to have a real belly-aching ninny fits. Saying, well, I don't know what it means, but I'll tell you what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean the tithe, because it can't mean the tithe. We're free from the law. So whatever Paul means here, one thing I'm sure of, he doesn't mean is tithing. And boy, howdy, do people love being free from the law when it comes to tithing. Now, it's the same people have conniption fits when you start talking about taking the Ten Commandments out of one of our halls of justice. There is some inconsistency there. But people really get tied up in a knot when you start talking about tithing, when you start talking about Sabbath keeping, and they say, boy, we're free from the law. It's a convenient argument, but it is a legitimate argument. We are free from the law. We're free from the law. The law is not our master. The law, as Paul puts it in Galatians 3:24, is our school master, our tutor. Let me ask you something. Are you all finished? You done learning? Have you reached perfection? Does your schoolmaster have nothing more to teach you? Back in the mid-1930s, the Metropolitan Opera House established a rule. No encores. No encores. It was just flat out a rule that they had there. No matter how good a performance was, no matter how long the audience cheered, no matter how loudly or insistently the audience asked and called for encores, no encore was forthcoming. Even when Leontine Price brought down the house with La Canzone di Doretta from La Rondine by Puccini, and the audience applauded so long that some of them were bleeding from the hands, applauding for 14 minutes with Miss Price lying prostrate on the stage because she was so humbled by their love and adoration, sobbing. There was no encore. That rule wasn't broken until this year, when Juan Diego Flores tore the roof off the house with A Mes Amis, singing it with more mastery and beauty and precision than had Pavarotti when he had done the same in 1967. And the audience broke out in an utter melee. That's when the house manager telephoned the pit and said, give them an encore. And this fellow, Juan Diego Flores, who is now heralded as the best tenor alive, he has a voice coach. And I suppose he always will. Pavarotti had a voice coach to the day he died. Tiger Woods has a coach, a tutor. Michael Phelps has a coach, a tutor. And the Apostle Paul had a tutor, the law. And he consulted her to guide his conscience regularly. Now, who among us has better mastery over the Christian enterprise than any of these other masters that I've mentioned have over their own disciplines? None of us. God gave us a tutor because we need a tutor. Now, you're right. We're not beneath the law. But the law is not beneath us. The law is beneath God. And we're beneath God. And God says, church, you would do well to listen to your older sister. I've left her with you for a reason. She's right there. And I've told her some things I haven't told you. You should listen to her. She has some things to tell you. So let's consult our tutor. When Paul says we're to give as God has prospered us, he obviously intends to indicate proportional giving. He clearly intends that the amount that we give will have some relationship to the amount that we've received. And that relationship will be a direct correspondence of some kind. That in some sense, what you give will be determined by what you have received. Now, the last time I taught a class on giving, someone asked me, well, why do I have to consider my giving in terms of proportional giving? Why can't it just be whatever I've determined in my heart? Why does it have to be a percentage of my income? And my answer then is it will be a percentage of your income, whether you think about it that way or not. No matter how you arrive at the figure, even if you don't give any thought to it. Well, let's say you make $100 a week. The plate comes around, you don't even think about it. You just reach in your pocket and throw in a handful of change. Whatever the amount is, it is a percentage of your income. That's inescapable. But the other reason for considering it in terms of proportion is because that's the criteria that God uses. God talks about our giving in terms of proportion. Well, what proportion do you think Paul had in mind? Paul says here we're to give in proportion to what God has given us. What proportion did Paul have in mind? Well, he doesn't tell us what proportion he has in mind, but he knows one, the one ordained by God in the Old Testament. So just for grins, let's take a look at that model. Let's take a look at the Old Testament model for just a minute, just in case. The only model that we know Paul knows is the one that he's referring to when he talks about proportional giving. And let's see what that would look like. If we allowed the model that's given in the Old Testament to guide our conscience in our giving, what would that look like for us in the church? Well, the simplest interpretation of the law, if you just look at it, just glance over it, just read through it very quickly. The simplest interpretation of the law is that the law required fathers to give 10% of their income, 10% of their net income. That's a tithe. However, there's actually more to it than that, and a careful reading of the Old Testament reveals that the letter of the law required more of the faithful than to give 10%. Much more, actually. Turn, if you will, to Leviticus 27:30. Leviticus 27:30. And all the tithe of the land, whether of the seed of the land or the fruit of the tree, is the Lord's. It's holy unto the Lord. And if a man will redeem aught of his tithe, he shall add unto it a fifth part thereof. Concerning the tithe of the herd or of the flock, even whatsoever passes under the rod, the tenth shall be holy unto the Lord. Now first I'd like to point out here that this statement that begins the text here, the tithe belongs to the Lord. That isn't a command. That's a fact. That's not a law. That's a statement of fact. That's a premise on which the law is built. The tithe belongs to the Lord. Abraham recognized that. Abraham comes long before the law, and he tithed because he knew that the tithe is holy to the Lord. The tithe belongs to the Lord, whether we give it to him or not. And in Malachi 3:8, we're told that we're thieves and robbers if we don't turn over to him what already belongs to him. Now second, we see here that the tithe consists of the land, the seed of the land, fruit of the tree, the herds and the flocks, which covers just about everything, because produce and livestock are money at this time. Produce and livestock are the currency of exchange of this economy in the time of Moses. Now there is a caveat for giving in another currency. Cash money, gold, is dispreferred at this time. God would rather have this offering in livestock and in produce. But you can pay in cash if you want to. But if you do, there's a surcharge. That's what it says. And if a man shall redeem aught of his tithe, he shall add unto it a fifth part thereof. So let's say you've got 10 cows, and the 10th one weighs 1,000 pounds, and let's say beef on the hoof is 20 cents a pound. That animal's worth $200. But if you don't want to give the animal, if you want to keep it, you want to give cash instead, God says you can do that, but you have to add a fifth part to its value, 20%. So if you want to keep the cow and not give it away, you can do that, but you have to give $240, not $200. So the rate of the tithe is 10% if you give in the usual currency of exchange of crops and livestock, but 12% if you give it in cash. But let's make it easy on ourselves. Let's just stick with 10%, shall we? I mean, the cash is the usual currency of exchange for our society, and I think a good argument could be made if you wanted to be legalistic about it, which we're not trying to be legalistic about it. But if you wanted to make that kind of argument, you could say, well, our usual currency of exchange is cash, and there should be a penalty for trying to convert it into anything else. So let's just make it 10%. Agreed? Okay. 10% of what? 10% of that which passes under the rod. And the way that this was done is that the sheep were herded into a fold, and then a narrow gate was opened up. And as they went out, they could only go out one at a time, and they had a rod, and they let literally the sheep pass under the rod, and they counted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. The 10th one got hit on the head. That one goes to the Lord. Well, now, wait a minute, you might say. Some of those sheep are last year's sheep. That's not right. They've already been counted. I started off with 200 sheep this year. Now I've got 250 sheep, but I shouldn't have to give 25 sheep, just 5. Well, your math is different from God's math. God says the tithe is not just on your income for this year, but on everything you have in the bank as well. It's 10% of your income and 10% of your holdings. That's the way God calculates the tithe. Now, by the same token, at some point in the year, this guy's sheep, his flock, let's say he had 300 sheep at one point, but he ate some of them, and he used some of them to pay his bills. Well, God doesn't hold him accountable for those. He doesn't charge him for the cost of doing business, just for his income and his holdings. So in modern terms, the tithe, if we were legally bound to it, which we're not legally bound to it, but if we were, that would be 10% of your net income, plus on an annual basis, 10% of what you have in the bank. Now, where did that tithe go? The first tithe, where did it go? According to Numbers 18, 21 and following, it went to the Levites. All of it. To the Levites. None of it was kept by the worshiper. None of it was eaten by the worshiper. None of it went to charity. It all went to the Levites, the whole first tithe. And if you consult 1 Corinthians 9, 13 through 14 on this matter, you'll find that that corresponds with the church and the ministers thereof. Well, what about charity? And what do you mean by first tithe? Are there 2 tithes? No. There are 3 in the Old Testament. The first tithe went to the Levites, and that tithe was non-negotiable. The second tithe, which is described in Deuteronomy 14, 22 and following, that wasn't so much given as it was set aside to be spent in consecrated ways. It was set aside money. Now that tithe was also a tithe of everything on crops, oil, wine, herds, flocks. However, it was a tithe on everything that was left after the first tithe. So it's actually not 10% of your income, just 9%. And this tithe did not go to the Levites. This tithe was used to make 3 pilgrimages a year for 3 feasts. The Passover, the Feast of Tabernacles, and the Feast of Weeks. Now, unlike the first tithe, the second tithe could be converted into cash without penalty. There was more flexibility with the second tithe. And this tithe the worshiper did partake in and could share it with anyone he wanted to. There was a lot of freedom in this second tithe. The money was for feasts dedicated to God, and it was out of the second tithe that the worshipers were to take their offerings for all of their sin offerings and guilt offerings and all of the other offerings that you hear about in the Bible. These come out of the second tithe. Now, the overall purpose for these sacred feasts was to foster religious principles among the religious community at large. This had to do with teaching your faith to your children and celebrating your faith among the faithful. And it also had to do with atoning for your sins through your giving, paying your vows, paying your penalties. So one time, as I was teaching this, someone asked me, well, I spend a lot of money sending my kids to Christian schools. Can I take that out of my tithe? And I said, well, yes. I said, you don't want to be legalistic about it. I said, but if you're going to follow this model, if this is the model you want to follow, then don't take it out of your first tithe. That goes to the church. But you can take it out of your second tithe. The second tithe of the Old Testament symbolized in type and shadow your giving to Christian causes that go beyond your commitment to your local congregation. So it can go to any cause that promotes Christian values. And since you partake in the joy, it can go to things that you participate in. So that $100 a plate charity meal, buying Girl Scout cookies, buying Christmas gifts, for that matter, the cost of Thanksgiving dinner, that can all come out of the second tithe. And since the second tithe was also for paying your vows and for paying your penalties, if you get a speeding ticket, there you go. You've got money already set aside. It's there in the second tithe. But again, this isn't so much given, the second tithe, as it is set aside for spending in a consecrated way. The third tithe is described in Deuteronomy 14, 28 through 29. And that tithe was specifically for personal almsgiving. It was specifically for the believer to give directly to the stranger and the fatherless and the widow. Now that tithe comes out after the first tithe and the second tithe, so it's really only about 8% of your income. And mercifully, it was only given once every 3 years. The third tithe wasn't given every year, it was given only once every 3 years. So that comes out to, on an annualized basis, to about 3% a year. Now 3% is rounded up, but let's round up. Since all the Israelites were also required to leave the gleanings of their fields for the poor, let's just let that be part of the third tithe and round it up to 3% a year rather than 2.12% or whatever it would be otherwise. That's the third tithe. So, if we wanted to maintain the same standard for ourselves in the church as was maintained in the Old Testament, we'd all be giving about 22% of our net income and holdings. Giving 10% directly to the church, to the local congregation, and setting aside 9% for things like Christian education, missions, Christmas gifts, causes that advance the Christian enterprise, and then another 3% for giving directly to the poor, directly to almsgiving. Now at this point, you may be saying to yourself, good night, nurse. I was afraid to come today because I knew Joe was going to talk about tithing, and 10% is far too much for me to give. It's impractical. I can't afford to give 10%. And now you're talking about giving 22%? Thank God we're free from the law. Thank goodness. We really dodged a bullet there, didn't we? And you're right. I mean, 10% does seem like a lot if you're not used to giving that amount, and if you're not disposed to giving that much. And 22% seems astronomical, unless you consider that most of that money really is money that you're already spending. But if you were following this model, then you'd be giving it in a purposive way. It would be consecrated money, and you'd have already spent it in your mind. It would be part of your budget. But again, you're right. We're free from the law. Paul simply said to give as God has prospered you. No one is legally obligated to give any specific amount under the new covenant. Now, under the new covenant, at least in our tradition, in the churches of Christ, we believe that we're bound by conscience to do, to live into whatever we receive by command, example, and necessary inference. So let's take a look at some of the New Testament examples of giving and commands. This is what giving looks like if we were to follow the New Testament model. Matthew 19:21. Matthew 19:21. Jesus said unto him, If thou wilt be perfect, go and sell all that thou hast, and give to the poor, and thou shalt have treasure in heaven, and come follow me. Now here Jesus isn't recommending anything like the tithe. He's recommending giving 100%. Now, of course, this is what Jesus said to the rich young ruler. And as I said a couple weeks ago when I was teaching on this passage, almost no one takes what Jesus said to that guy to heart personally. I mean, Jesus was telling him what he needed to do to attain to perfection, but he had a problem. He was rich and selfish. Well, I'm not rich and selfish, so it doesn't apply to me. Jesus doesn't really want us to give 100%, does he? Well, maybe not. But he did have high praise for those who did give 100%. Mark 12:41. Mark 12:41 and following. And Jesus sat over against the treasury, and beheld how the people cast money into the treasury. And many that were rich cast in much. And there came a certain poor widow, and she threw in 2 mites, which make a farthing. And he called unto him his disciples, and said unto them, Verily I say unto you, that this poor widow has cast more in than all the others which have cast into the treasury. For they all did cast in of their abundance, but she of her want did cast in all that she had, even all her living. Jesus clearly had a high level of appreciation for this woman because she gave 100%. Now, whenever I've taught on this passage, I've actually had people come up to me and say, well, it's easier to give 100% when you don't have anything. I mean, if I was this poor widow, I'd give 100% too. Huh. Would you really? Well, some Christians would. Some Christians have. Acts 2:44. And all that believed were together and had all things in common, and sold their possessions and goods, and parted them to all men, as every man had need. Acts 4:32 and following. And the multitude of them that believed were of one heart and of one soul. Neither said any of them that aught of the things which he possessed was his own, but they all had all things in common. And with great power gave the apostles witness of the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and great grace was upon them all. Neither was there any among them that lacked, for as many as were possessors of lands or houses sold them, and brought the prices of the things that were sold, and laid them down at the apostles' feet. And distribution was made unto every man according as he had need. Under the new covenant, we're free from the law. We're not under the law. We're under grace. The first church understood that. They knew that. According to Acts 4:33, great grace was upon them all. And having been set free from the law, free from the tithe, placed under grace, what did they do? Well, just like you and me, just like modern Christians, they decided that tithing was unacceptable. Wouldn't be caught dead giving a tithe. No, the only thing they thought was right to do was to give 100%. They're not slaves to the law. They're not limited by that pittance of 10%. A mere 22% is an insult. The only right thing to do is to give 100% as far as they were concerned. Now, Joe, come on, that isn't fair. I mean, these were first-hand witnesses of the crucifixion, of the Pentecost, and of the resurrection. Surely they were caught up in a fervor. You can't consider this kind of giving normative for the church. Well, fine. I'll let you off the hook for that. You're right about that. I happen to be of the opinion that that kind of giving is impractical in the extreme and is ultimately unsustainable. I think that's one of the reasons for some of the problems they had in the Jerusalem church. You know, a couple of weeks ago I was telling you that Peter, James, and John had a nickname for themselves, a title of honor. They called themselves the poor. Well, that was a nickname for themselves, but where did it come from? Well, one of the reasons that they got that nickname is because they were poor, but it was a problem of their own making. They established a church that the modus that they set up in this church was that people gave 100% of what they had, shared all things in common, but they also quit their jobs and let the church take care of them. Well, if you know anything about economic theory, you know that's not sustainable. That isn't going to work. Paul didn't do that. Paul planted churches that remained intact in their society at large. And the church members remained employed, remained productive, and gave week to week. Well, how much did they give? Well, we only have that specific information on one of Paul's congregations, and that's on the Macedonians. 2 Corinthians 8. Starting in verse 1. 2 Corinthians 8, 1. Moreover, brethren, we do you to wit of the grace of God bestowed on the churches of Macedonia, that in a great trial of affliction, the abundance of their joy and their deep poverty abounded in the fulfillment of their purpose. For I bear witness that according to their ability, yes, and beyond their ability, they were freely willing, imploring us with much urgency that we would take into our hands the grace they were sowing, and so participate together with them in the ministering to the holy ones. So how much did the Macedonians give? Well, it wasn't 10%, it wasn't 22%, it wasn't 100%. It was 110%. They didn't just give more than they could afford. The language here strongly indicates that they gave more than they even had. They borrowed money to give to the church. That's what freedom from the law produces in people who want to give. But believe it or not, there's one person in the Bible who gave even more than that. Luke 10. In Luke 10, we have the story of the Good Samaritan. Now, the Samaritan didn't give all that he had, at least not right away. Instead, you know the story. He wrote a blank check. He gives the innkeeper his pledge, his promise, his word of honor, that he will pay the bill for taking care of this injured man, whatever the cost may be. Can you imagine that? Offering to pay somebody's hospital bill, no matter how high it went. And remember, this guy wasn't going to be in the hospital for a short while. He had been beaten half to death. It was going to take a considerable sum for him to be well, and he didn't know how long it would take him to be well. The Samaritan opened himself up to unlimited liability. He opened himself up to the potential that he might have to give 100% of what he has and then some for years to come. Now, I could give more examples, but no more are needed. You get the idea. Paul's command to all the churches is that week by week we're to give, and that giving is to be done proportionally. It's to be done in proportion to what God has given to us. And I started this lesson with the question, well, what proportion does Paul have in mind? And since Paul's words are God's words, what proportion does God have in mind? And the answer is this. If you let the Old Testament inform your conscience, if you let that be your model, then the very least, the starkest interpretation of God's intention, of his expectation of what faithful people would give, is 10% of one's net income. If you let the New Testament inform your conscience on this matter, the possibilities are endless. They start with giving lands and houses, and then go to 100% and beyond. So how much should you give? How much should I give? Well, frankly, when it comes down to brass tacks, that's between you and God. I don't know how much anybody in this congregation gives, and I don't want to know. I don't see the collection. I don't examine it. I don't ever want to do that. The purpose of this lesson is to inform your conscience and to set the bar ditches. What we receive under the new covenant is far superior to what the Israelites received under the old covenant. And frankly, for that reason, I don't know how any Christian in good conscience determines in their heart that they ought to give less than 10%. That they ought to give less than what a faithful Jew gave under the old covenant. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, the New Testament example is to give 100%. Well, I'm too practical, perhaps too fearful, not faithful enough to go there. It doesn't make sense to me to give 100% of my income. Frankly, it seems irresponsible. So how much should I give? How much should you give? Again, that's between you and God. I don't know exactly, but my best counsel, the best advice I can give you is that the right amount for you lies somewhere between 10% and 100%. It's up to you to work out the details. Wherefore, my beloved, as ye always have obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God which worketh in you both to will and to do of his good pleasure. That's my lesson for today.